Other jailers soon arrived. Then came the heavy, measured footsteps of soldiers. Behind them came the governor. Dantes heard the bed creaking as they tried to rouse the dead man. The governor ordered them to throw water in his face. Then, seeing that this had no effect, he sent for the doctor. The governor left the cell, and several words of compassion, mingled with crude jokes and laughter, reached Dantes' ears. "Well," said one voice, "the old lunatic's gone off to find his treasure. Bon voyage." "With all his millions, he still didn't have enough to pay for his shroud," said another. "Oh, the shrouds of the Chateau d'If don't cost much. Since he's a priest, maybe they'll go to a little extra expense for him." "That's right. He'll have the honor of the sack." Dantes listened without losing a word, but he did not understand much of what was being said. Soon the voices died away, and it seemed to him that everyone had left the cell. He was nevertheless afraid to go back in. A jailer might have been left behind to guard the dead man. After an hour or so of silence was broken by a faint noise, which gradually grew louder. It was the governor coming back, followed by the doctor and several officials. There was a moment of silence. The doctor was evidently examining the body. He declared the prisoner dead and diagnosed the cause of death. "Not that I doubt your competence, doctor," said the governor, "but we can't be satisfied with a mere examination in such cases. I just ask you to carry out the formalities prescribed by law." "Very well, then," said the doctor. "Heat up the irons." This order made Dantes shudder. He heard hurried footsteps and the sound of a door being opened. Several moments later, a jailer came back into the cell. Then the thick, nauseating odor of burning flesh penetrated the wall behind which Dantes was listening in horror. Beads of sweat burst out on his forehead, and for a moment he thought he was going to faint. "You see, he's really dead," said the doctor. "That burn on the heel is decisive. The poor madman is cured of his madness and delivered from his captivity." Dantes heard a sound like the rustling of cloth. The bed creaked. There were heavy footsteps, like those of a man lifting a burden, and the bed creaked once again under the weight which had been placed back on it. "Will there be a mass?" asked one of the officials. "Impossible," replied the governor. "The chaplain asked me for a week's leave yesterday, and he's already gone. If the poor priest hadn't been in such a hurry, he'd have his requiem." "That's all right," remarked the doctor, with the impiety common to those of his profession. "God won't give the devil the pleasure of receiving a priest." There was a burst of laughter. Meanwhile, the body had been laid out. "Tonight," said the governor. "What time?" asked one of the jailers. "At around 10 or 11 o'clock, as usual." "Shall we watch over the body?" "What for? Just lock the door as though he were still alive." The footsteps went away, and the voices died down. Then a silence more mournful than that of solitude, the silence of death, invaded everything and chilled the depths of Dantes' heart. He slowly raised the stone with his head and cast a swift glance around the cell. It was empty. He entered. Stretched out on the bed, faintly illuminated by the pale ray of daylight coming in through the window, he saw a sack of coarse cloth under whose ample folds he could discern the outlines of a long, stiff form. It was Faria's shroud, that shroud which, according to the jailers, cost so little. It was all over. Dantes was separated forever from his old friend. Faria, his helpful, kind companion, now existed only in his memory. He sat down on the edge of the frightful bed, plunged in deep and bitter melancholy. Alone. He was alone again. The idea of suicide, which his friend's presence had driven away, now rose up again like a phantom beside his corpse. "If only I could die," he said. "I'd go where he's gone, and I'd be with him again. But how can I die?" He thought for a moment, then said, smiling, "It's very easy. I'll stay here and attack the first man who comes in. I'll strangle him, and they'll guillotine me." But then he recoiled from the idea of such an infamous death, and swiftly passed from despair to a burning thirst for life and freedom. "Die? Oh no," he cried out. "What would be the point of having lived and suffered so much if I were going to die now? No, I want to live, to fight on to the end. I want to win back the happiness that was taken away from me. I must punish my enemies before I die, and I may also have some friends to reward. But they'll forget me here, and the only way I'll ever leave this dungeon is like Faria." As he spoke these words, he sat stock still, staring into space like a man suddenly struck by a terrifying idea. Then he stood up, put his hand to his forehead as though he were dizzy, and murmured, "You sent me this thought? Was it you, O God? Since only the dead leave here, I'll take the place of a corpse." Without giving himself time to reconsider his desperate resolution, he leaned over the hideous sack, slit it open with the knife which Faria had made, took out the corpse, carried it into his own cell, put it on his bed, wrapped around its head the rag which he himself always wore, pulled his blanket over it, kissed the cold forehead one last time, tried once again to close the rebellious eyes which persisted in remaining open, and turned the head to the wall so that when the jailer brought in his evening meal, he would think he was already asleep, as he often was. Then he went back into Faria's cell, took out the needle and thread, and threw off his clothes so that the jailers could feel bare flesh under the sackcloth, slipped into the sack, placed himself in the same position as the corpse, and sewed up the sack again from the inside. If the jailers had happened to come in at that moment, they would have heard the beating of his heart. His plan was all worked out. If the grave diggers discovered that they were carrying a living man instead of a corpse, he would quickly rip open the sack with his knife and take advantage of their terror to escape. If they tried to stop him, he would use the knife on them. If they carried him all the way to the cemetery and laid him in a grave, he would let himself be covered over. Then, since it would be night, as soon as the grave diggers had turned their backs, he would force his way up through the soft earth and escape. He hoped the weight would not be too heavy for him to raise. Otherwise, he would be smothered to death. But even this possibility did not dismay him. At least everything would be finished. Toward 7 o'clock in the evening, his anxiety began in earnest. He trembled in every limb, and his heart felt as though it were being gripped in an icy vice. The hours passed without bringing the slightest movement in the prison. So far, his ruse had not been discovered. Finally, he heard footsteps on the stairs. The time had come. He summoned up all his courage, held his breath, and tried to repress the pounding of his heart. The door opened, and a dim light reached his eyes. Through the cloth covering him, he saw 2 shadows approach the bed. A third one stood in the doorway holding a lantern. The first 2 men took hold of the sack from both ends. Dantes made his body rigid. "He's very heavy for such a skinny old man," said one. "They say every year adds half a pound to the weight of a man's bones," said the other. They carried him out on a stretcher, and the funeral procession, led by the man with the lantern, went up the stairs. Suddenly, Dantes felt the cold, fresh night air and the sharp wind from the sea. Then sensation filled him with both joy and anxiety. They carried him some 20 yards further, then stopped and laid the stretcher on the ground. Dantes heard one of the men walking away. "Where am I?" he wondered. His first impulse was to try to escape, but fortunately he controlled himself. A few moments later, he heard one of the men walk up to him and drop a heavy object on the ground. At the same time, he felt a rope tied around his feet with a painful tightness. "Have you made the knot?" asked the man who had remained idle. "Yes, and it's well made, I'll answer for that." "All right, then, let's go." The stretcher was raised again, and the procession continued on its way, the sound of waves breaking against the rocks on which the Chateau d'If is built reached Dantes more distinctly with each step. "What miserable weather," said one of the men. "I wouldn't like to be at sea tonight." "Yes," said the other, "there's a good chance the priest may get his feet wet." They both burst out laughing. Dantes did not understand the joke, but his hair stood on end nevertheless. "Here we are," said the first man after a while. "No, further on. You know the last one got smashed on the rocks, and the next day the governor called us a couple of lazy rascals." They went on a few more steps. Then Dantes felt them pick him up by the head and feet and swing him back and forth. 1, 2, 3. With the last word, he felt himself flung into space. Fear clutched at his heart as he fell like a wounded bird, down, down, down. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, there was a tremendous splash, and he plunged like an arrow into the icy sea. He uttered a scream, which was immediately choked off as the water closed over his head. He was being swiftly dragged to the bottom by a cannonball tied to his feet. The sea is the cemetery of the Chateau d'If. And that's the end of chapter 12. We will continue with chapter 13.